The silent language, what people say before they speak. Have you ever walked into a room and felt within seconds that something was off? No one said anything alarming. The music was pleasant. The lights were warm. And yet your chest tightened, your breath shortened, and some invisible part of you whispered, "Be careful here." That instinct, that wordless alarm, is not magic. It is not paranoia. It is your brain doing something it has been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. Reading people. Long before language existed, human beings were already communicating. A raised eyebrow across a savanna, a subtle shift in posture at the entrance of a cave, the brief flicker of tension around a stranger's jaw. These microsignals were the original internet. Instant, universal, and nearly impossible to fake. Modern civilization gave us words, grammar, and eloquence. But it never erased the older system running underneath. That older system is what this book is about. Every day, in every conversation, every meeting, every first date, every negotiation, two entirely separate conversations are taking place at the same time. One is verbal, the words being chosen, the sentences being constructed, the arguments being made. The other is silent, a continuous stream of signals flowing through posture, breath, micro-movements, vocal tone, and the precise timing of a glance. Most people are fluent in the first conversation. Almost no one is truly literate in the second. And that gap, that vast, unexplored territory between what people say and what they mean, is exactly where the human compass lives. Scientific research has spent decades mapping this territory. The findings are consistently striking. Studies across multiple universities and behavioral research institutes have confirmed that well over 60% of all human communication is nonverbal. In some interpersonal contexts, particularly emotionally charged ones, that figure climbs even higher. What this means, in practical terms, is that when someone tells you they are fine, they are actually telling you very little. The real answer is in the tightness around their eyes, the micro-pause before they spoke, the way their shoulders dropped slightly, as if releasing something they had been holding in silence. FBI behavioral analysts understand this better than almost anyone. Dr. Janine Wheeler, a former hostage negotiation consultant based in Quantico, spent over 2 decades training field agents to read behavioral patterns under extreme pressure. In her seminars, she would open with the same exercise. 2 agents would sit across from each other, and one would lie. Not about a crime, about something trivial. A childhood memory, a favorite restaurant, a small personal preference. The task for the observer was not to catch the lie through logic or clever questioning. It was to feel for the moment when the body said something the mouth did not. People think lying is about words, she would tell trainees. It isn't. Lying is an act of psychological labor, and that labor leaks. It leaks in the form of microtensions, a barely perceptible tightening of the jaw, a fraction of a second delay before the smile reaches the eyes, a slight pulling back of the head, as if the body itself wants to create distance from the statement being made. These signals are not deliberate. They are not conscious. They are the nervous system's honest response to the effort of concealment. But here is what makes this truly powerful. You do not have to be lying for your body to reveal something. The same principle applies to joy, to fear, to excitement, to hesitation, to attraction, to shame. Every significant emotional state has a corresponding physical signature, and once you learn to read those signatures, once you develop what behavioral scientists call baseline awareness, the world becomes a fundamentally different place. The baseline, your most essential tool. Every skilled reader of human behavior starts in the same place, not with the unusual, but with the ordinary. Before you can recognize a deviation, You must first understand what normal looks like for a specific person. This concept is called baseline behavior, and it is the cornerstone of everything that follows in this book. A person's baseline is their default state, the way they naturally move, speak, hold themselves, and make eye contact when they are at ease and under no particular pressure. It is their behavioral home base. Consider a scenario. You are meeting a colleague, Marcus, for a weekly check-in. Over many weeks, you have noticed that Marcus is a natural talker, quick, animated, comfortable with eye contact, prone to using his hands when making a point. He laughs easily. He rarely crosses his arms. He tends to lean slightly forward when engaged. That is his baseline. Now, one Thursday afternoon, Marcus comes into the meeting and something is different. He is still talking, still saying the right things, but his hands are still. His sentences come a beat slower. When you make eye contact, he holds it just slightly too long, as if consciously keeping himself from looking away. His shoulders are marginally higher than usual, suggesting a low-level muscular tension he may not even be aware of. None of this means Marcus is lying. None of this means he is dangerous or untrustworthy. But something in his internal landscape has shifted, and his body is reporting that shift before he has said a word about it. That is baseline awareness in action, and noticing it creates an opening, an opportunity for a deeper conversation, a more genuine check-in, a moment of real human connection that would otherwise have been skipped in favor of surface-level pleasantries. The key insight here is that you are not looking for signs of deception. You are looking for signs of change. Any departure from a person's established baseline is information. The interpretation of that information depends entirely on context, which is why baseline awareness must always be paired with situational intelligence. We will return to this principle throughout the book. The first 5 seconds research on first impressions has produced one of the most startling findings in the psychology of human perception. We form our initial judgments about a person in roughly 4 to 7 seconds, before they have finished their opening sentence, before we have even consciously registered what they look like. Our brains have already begun constructing a preliminary model of who this person is, what their intentions might be, and whether we can trust them. This is not a flaw in human cognition. It is a feature, one that evolved for very practical reasons. In a world where a wrong judgment about a stranger's intentions could have fatal consequences, the ability to perform rapid social assessments was a matter of survival. The brain developed an extraordinarily fast threat detection system, drawing on every available signal simultaneously. Posture, gait, facial symmetry, eye movement, micro-muscle tension, even scent. Walk into any hotel lobby in the world and watch what happens in the first 2 seconds after someone enters. Notice how every person in that lobby makes an almost invisible adjustment. Eyes flicker toward the newcomer. Conversations don't stop, but they slow slightly. People who are sitting shift their weight. This is the human threat assessment system doing its constant work, not because anyone expects danger, but because that is simply what brains do. The posture of the entering person communicates an enormous amount in those first seconds. Are the shoulders pulled back, chest open, head level? That posture signals presence, confidence, and a kind of territorial ease, the body language of someone who feels they belong in the space they are entering. Contrast that with rounded shoulders, a slightly lowered chin, and small, contained movements which signal something closer to self-protection, uncertainty, or the desire to take up as little space as possible. Neither posture is inherently good or bad. Both are information. The question, always the question, is, what is the full context? A handshake is another micro-world of information. In dozens of cultures around the world, the ritual of extending the hand when meeting a stranger carries a biochemical function as well as a social one. It allows people to briefly make skin-to-skin contact, which triggers a small release of oxytocin, the brain chemical associated with trust and social bonding. The strength and texture of the grip adds another layer. A firm, confident grip combined with natural eye contact signals self-assurance and openness. An excessively strong grip combined with leaning forward can signal a dominance orientation. A limp or brief grip paired with averted gaze often signals discomfort, shyness, or a person who would rather not be in that particular room at that particular moment. But here, and this cannot be said often enough, context is everything. A person who has been working physically all day will grip differently than a person who has been at a keyboard. A person from a culture where firm physical contact is rare may offer a gentle handshake as a sign of respect, not weakness. Reading people accurately requires reading their circumstances at the same time. Mirroring, the invisible language of connection. Of all the behavioral patterns that reveal the state of a relationship, one of the most reliable is mirroring, the unconscious tendency for people to subtly replicate the body language, posture, facial expressions, and even breathing rhythms of those they feel connected to. You are at a dinner party in Edinburgh, deep in conversation with someone you have just met. Without realizing it, you tilt your head slightly to one side. 30 seconds later, they tilt theirs in the same direction. You pick up your glass. A few moments later, they pick up theirs. You lean back. They follow. This is mirroring, and it is one of the brain's most fundamental expressions of rapport. The reason mirroring happens is rooted in the neuroscience of social bonding. When we feel safe and positively connected with another person, the brain shifts into a mode of social synchronization, a kind of invisible tuning toward the other person's frequency. We begin to match their energy, their rhythm, their physical orientation. It happens below the level of conscious awareness, and precisely because it is unconscious, it is one of the most honest signals available. When mirroring disappears, when one person in a conversation begins to break synchrony, pulling back, turning slightly away, moving into closed or self-protective postures, that shift signals a change in the emotional temperature of the interaction. Something has cooled, a connection that was forming has paused or begun to fade. A good conversationalist notices this not as a failure but as information. Something has shifted, and it may be time to recalibrate. Understanding the silent language, baseline behavior, first impression dynamics, and the principles of mirroring is the foundation of everything that follows. These are not techniques for manipulation. They are tools for literacy, for understanding the full content of what is being communicated rather than just the words sitting on the surface. The people who have mastered this literacy, therapists, exceptional leaders, master negotiators, the most compelling teachers you have ever had, share a common ability. They make you feel deeply seen. Not because they are performing attention, but because they genuinely are attending at every level to every channel of information you are sending. That capacity is learnable. It begins with the decision to pay attention to what has always been there, waiting to be read. In the chapters that follow, we will move from the general principles of behavioral reading into the specific, the face, the voice, the hands, the subconscious architecture of trust, and finally, the most important direction any compass can point, inward. The face never lies. Microexpressions and the architecture of emotion. There is a photograph taken at the 1972 Munich Olympics that most people have never seen, but behavioral scientists have studied for decades. It was taken 3 seconds before an athlete received news that would change the trajectory of his life. In that 3-second window, before the news arrived, before words were spoken, before the situation became real, the photograph captured something extraordinary. A micro-expression of pure, raw, anticipatory dread, lasting less than 1/5 of a second, that passed across the athlete's face like weather across a plain. He was smiling. And beneath the smile, for a fraction of a moment that no camera of that era should have been fast enough to catch, his face told a different story entirely. That photograph, and thousands like it, formed the evidentiary foundation of one of the most important research programs in the history of emotional psychology. The scientist at the center of it, a San Francisco-based psychologist named Dr. Paul Ekman, had been asking a deceptively simple question since the early 1960s. Are human facial expressions universal? Do people in Tokyo and Tanzania, in Sao Paulo and Stockholm, express sadness with the same face? Is happiness or fear or contempt a learned cultural behavior, or something deeper, something wired into the architecture of the human nervous system itself? To find the answer, Ekman traveled to Papua New Guinea in the late 1960s and showed photographs of emotional expressions to members of a tribe that had had almost no contact with Western culture or media. If expressions were learned, the tribe members should have struggled to identify them. Instead, they matched them to emotional states with the same accuracy as college students in New York City. The conclusion Ekman reached changed everything we thought we knew about the face. There are 7 basic emotions that are expressed with identical facial configurations across all human cultures: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust, and contempt. These 7 are not learned. They are not cultural. They are biological. They are, in the truest sense, the human face's mother tongue. 7 expressions, 7 windows. Understanding each of these 7 expressions, knowing exactly which muscles move, in which direction, at which speed, gives you a remarkable tool for emotional literacy. Let's examine each one not as an abstract concept, but as a physical reality you can observe, recognize, and respond to. Genuine happiness, what Ekman called a Duchenne smile, after the French neurologist who first described it, involves the entire face. The corners of the mouth curve upward, the cheeks lift, and critically, the muscles around the eyes contract, creating the characteristic crow's feet at the outer corners. The eyes themselves appear to narrow slightly and brighten. This is the smile that cannot be fully faked, because the muscles around the eyes, the orbicularis oculi, are not under reliable voluntary control. We can will our mouth into a smile shape. We cannot will our eyes to smile. That is why, in any interaction, the eyes are the first place to look when assessing the authenticity of a positive expression. Sadness narrows the energy in the face. The inner corners of the eyebrows draw upward and together, creating a characteristic triangular shape in the brow. The corners of the mouth pull downward, sometimes with a slight trembling. The gaze lowers or goes inward. There is a quality of withdrawal, of the face turning slightly away from the external world. Even a micro-expression of sadness, lasting less than 1/4 of a second, carries this unmistakable signature, and learning to recognize it is one of the most powerful tools for empathy you can develop. Fear opens the face outward in preparation for rapid processing of threat information. The eyes widen, the better to take in peripheral information. The eyebrows rise and pull together in a distinctive shape. The mouth opens slightly, the lips drawn back horizontally. The nostrils flare. The entire configuration maximizes sensory input. Bigger eyes, open airways, facial muscles primed for rapid movement. If you have ever been startled and then looked in a mirror immediately afterward, you have seen what fear looks like. It is unmistakable, and it lingers in the face even when the conscious mind is already rationalizing it away. Anger hardens the face. The brows lower and draw together, creating vertical creases at the center of the forehead. The eyes take on a fixed, narrowed quality, the gaze of focus and threat assessment. The nostrils widen, the jaw tightens, the lips press together or the teeth become visible. There is a quality of compression and forward energy, the body gathering itself. Anger, more than almost any other emotion, is visible in the face well before it manifests as behavior, which is one of the reasons that skilled mediators learn to read it early. Surprise is perhaps the most time-limited of the 7 expressions. The eyebrows shoot upward and arch. The eyes open wide. The mouth drops open. This configuration, the brain's response to something it did not predict and needs to rapidly classify as threat or reward, typically lasts no more than 2 to 3 seconds in its genuine form. If a surprised expression persists beyond that, it is almost certainly performed rather than felt. Real surprise is brief because the brain quickly processes the unexpected information and the face moves on to whatever emotional response follows. Disgust is a powerful and primordial expression rooted in the body's defense against contamination. The nose wrinkles and the upper lip rises, sometimes on one side, sometimes on both. The eyes narrow and the face takes on a quality of pushing away. Evolutionarily, this expression was triggered by rotten food or disease. In the modern world, it appears just as reliably in response to morally offensive ideas, repellent social situations, or behaviors that violate a person's deeply held values. When you see disgust flash across someone's face during a conversation, even briefly, they have just encountered something that conflicts with something fundamental in them. Contempt is the most socially complex of the 7. Unlike the other 6, which involve both sides of the face symmetrically, contempt is almost always unilateral, a slight lifting of one corner of the lip, creating a half-sneer that can be almost imperceptible. This asymmetry is its signature. Contempt signals a sense of superiority, of looking down. It is distinct from anger, which typically involves some desire for the other person to change. Contempt has given up on change. It is the face of dismissal. Research by Dr. John Gottman at the University of Washington found that the presence of contempt in a relationship, even in brief isolated flickers, was one of the single strongest predictors of relationship failure over time. The microexpression, where the truth lives. All 7 of these expressions can appear in full, sustained form, lasting several seconds, visible to anyone paying attention. But they also appear in a radically compressed form, microexpressions, lasting between 1/15th and 1/25th of a second. These are the involuntary, instantaneous expressions that flash across the face before the conscious mind can suppress them, mask them, or replace them with something more socially acceptable. A micro-expression of fear on a face that is attempting to project calm. A micro-expression of disgust during an approving nod. Micro-expression of contempt beneath a professional smile. These flashes are the nervous system's uncensored commentary on what a person is actually experiencing in real time. Learning to see micro-expressions takes practice because they move at a speed the casual eye is not trained to track. But research has consistently shown that this is a learnable skill. Participants who receive training in micro-expression recognition show significant improvements not just in identifying specific emotions, but in overall interpersonal perception, in noticing when something is misaligned between what a person is saying and what they are experiencing. Consider a scene many people have experienced, a job performance review. Your manager is giving you feedback that is largely positive. They are speaking in measured, encouraging tones. They are using affirming language. And yet, 3 times during the conversation, you notice something. A barely visible compression of the lips, a slight narrowing of the eyes that doesn't match the warm words being spoken. Your brain registers this as a vague unease, a feeling that something is not quite right, that this conversation has an undercurrent you can't name. That unease is your brain reading microexpressions it cannot consciously articulate, but has definitely detected. The feeling is real, the data behind it is real. And developing the ability to consciously understand what your brain is already detecting unconsciously is one of the most practically powerful skills you can develop. The eyes, the deepest channel. If the face is the most revealing surface of the human body, the eyes are the most revealing feature of the face. Ancient philosophers understood this intuitively. The eyes have been called the windows of the soul across dozens of cultures and centuries. Modern neuroscience has confirmed that this intuition points to something biochemically real. The pupils, the dark centers of the eyes, respond involuntarily to emotional states in ways that are invisible to conscious control. When a person feels genuine interest, attraction, excitement, or joy, the pupils dilate, sometimes dramatically. When a person encounters something threatening, repellent, or deeply uncomfortable, the pupils contract. This dilation and contraction happens at a neurological speed, faster than any conscious behavioral response, and it is entirely involuntary. Because we cannot control our pupil response, the eyes carry a particular kind of truth. Advertisers have known this for decades. Eye tracking and pupillometry studies allow marketers to measure genuine interest in products or imagery with a precision that self-reported surveys can never achieve. Simply put, the eyes tell the truth even when everything else is performing a role. The rate of blinking is another channel that carries significant information. Under normal, unstressed conditions, a person blinks roughly 15 to 20 times per minute. That rate tends to increase under emotional or cognitive pressure. When someone is processing something uncomfortable, managing stress, or engaged in the cognitive labor of concealment. Conversely, blink rate drops in moments of intense focus and concentration, when the brain is locked onto something of genuine importance and does not want to lose a fraction of a second to the brief visual interruption of a blink. Eye contact patterns, too, are deeply informative and deeply context-dependent. In most Western professional contexts, consistent but not unbroken eye contact signals engagement, confidence, and honesty. Frequent, rapid eye aversion can signal discomfort, anxiety, social unease, or the cognitive effort of managing a difficult internal state. But sustained, unblinking eye contact, particularly when combined with other forward-oriented cues, can signal dominance, challenge, or aggression rather than openness. The critical skill here is not to apply a universal rule, but to read the full constellation of signals together. Eye contact does not mean anything in isolation. It means something in combination with facial expression, posture, vocal tone, and the specific social context in which the interaction is occurring. Reading authenticity. The real smile versus the social smile. Perhaps the most practically useful skill in facial expression, reading is the ability to distinguish between genuine and performed emotion, and nowhere is this more common than in the social smile. Human beings smile constantly. We smile to greet, we smile to reassure, we smile to manage social tension, we smile to indicate that we are not a threat. Many of these smiles carry no genuine happiness behind them at all. They are social tools, emotional management strategies, the equivalent of saying everything is fine with the face instead of the voice. The distinction between genuine and social smiling is subtle but reliable. A genuine smile, the Duchenne smile described earlier, involves the full face, including those involuntary eye muscles. A social smile typically involves only the lower half of the face. The mouth curves, the cheeks may lift slightly, but the eyes remain relatively uninvolved. The skin around them does not crinkle. The brightness does not appear. The face is performing an emotional state rather than experiencing one. Once you learn to look for this, once your eye is trained to the difference between a smile that reaches the eyes and one that stops at the cheekbones, you will begin to see it everywhere. In business meetings, at social gatherings, in political speeches, in customer service interactions. The social smile is everywhere, and while it is not inherently dishonest, we all manage our emotional presentations for good social reasons. Recognizing it allows you to understand the difference between performed comfort and genuine ease. A word of critical importance here. The ability to read faces is a powerful tool, and powerful tools require responsible use. The goal of this practice is never to catch people out, to gain leverage, or to weaponize insight. It is to be genuinely present, to inhabit your interactions fully enough to understand what is actually happening between you and another person. A face that reveals hidden sadness beneath a social smile is not a vulnerability to exploit. It is an invitation to show up more fully as a human being. Reading the face begins with the decision to truly look, not to process a person's appearance, but to receive them. That shift in attention from surface to depth is where real human connection begins. The voice within the voice, sound, rhythm, and the hidden language of tone. In 2004, a researcher at the University of Amsterdam named Nalini Ambady conducted an experiment that would become one of the most cited studies in the social psychology of communication. She took 30-second audio clips of surgeons speaking to their patients, clips from which all actual words had been stripped, leaving only the vocal tone, rhythm, and emotional texture of the speech. She then played these wordless clips to participants and asked them to rate the surgeon's warmth, hostility, dominance, and anxiety. The results were striking. The vocal tone ratings alone, with zero verbal content, were strongly predictive of which surgeons had faced malpractice suits and which had not. Not their skill, not their medical record, not the outcomes of their treatments, their voice, their emotional presence in the room as communicated through the music of their speech rather than its lyrics. This study illuminates something that most people sense but rarely examine. The voice carries an emotional signal that operates independently of language, and in many ways more powerfully than language. When someone tells you they are not upset, their words carry one message. But if their voice has gone flat and tight, if there is a faint tremor at the back of their throat, if their sentences have shortened and the pauses have grown, their voice is telling you something their words are not. Every human voice is a complex instrument that broadcasts emotional information across multiple channels simultaneously: pitch, volume, rhythm, tempo, resonance, the frequency of pauses, the presence or absence of vocal tremor. Each of these dimensions carries its own layer of information about the speaker's internal state. Learning to listen at this depth requires a shift in attention that most people have never been taught to make. The architecture of a voice. Pitch is perhaps the most immediately recognizable channel of vocal emotion. The human voice rises in pitch under conditions of anxiety, fear, excitement, or emotional distress, all states that cause the muscles around the vocal cords to tighten. This is a physiological response, not a performance choice. The tightening of the laryngeal muscles under stress is automatic, and it raises the fundamental frequency of the voice in ways that are detectable even when the speaker is consciously trying to control it. This is why skilled interviewers and investigators, whether in clinical, journalistic, or law enforcement contexts, pay close attention to subtle shifts in the pitch of a subject's voice when certain topics are introduced. A voice that has been speaking in a comfortable mid-range register and then rises slightly when a particular question is asked is not necessarily lying, but it is announcing that this territory carries some emotional weight. That is information, and it deserves further exploration. Conversely, a voice that deepens, that drops in pitch and slows in cadence, is typically signaling a shift into a more serious, deliberate, or emotionally heavy mode. This is the voice that a person uses when they are about to say something that matters to them. The body slows, the breath deepens, and the voice follows. Pay attention when someone shifts from their social register into this deeper, slower mode. They are telling you, without words, that what comes next carries real weight for them. Volume, in a less obvious way than pitch, also broadcasts internal state. Raised volume is the most obvious. The voice gets louder as emotional activation increases, whether through anger, excitement, or desperation. But quieted volume is equally telling and often more significant. A person who becomes unusually quiet in the middle of a conversation is often experiencing one of several states: deep emotional processing, the controlled management of strong feelings, or a strategic withholding of something important. The quiet voice requires the listener to lean in, both physically and attentively. Tempo, rhythm, and the patterns of hesitation. The speed at which someone speaks reveals enormous amounts about their cognitive and emotional state. Every person has a natural conversational tempo, a baseline rhythm of speech that reflects their personality, cultural background, and habitual energy level. Some people are natural fast talkers, others are measured and deliberate. Neither is better or worse. Both are simply characteristic. What matters is deviation from that personal baseline. When someone who typically speaks at a measured pace suddenly accelerates, something has shifted internally. The acceleration often signals anxiety, defensiveness, or the cognitive pressure of managing a difficult situation. The brain, working to maintain a performance or navigate an emotional minefield, may begin generating speech faster than is comfortable, rushing toward the end of a sentence before the listener can ask an inconvenient question about its middle. The opposite, a sudden slowing, carries its own signature. When a person pauses more than usual, when there are longer gaps between words or sentences, this often indicates deep processing. The brain is working hard, pulling more material from memory or constructing something carefully rather than speaking from a natural flow. In certain contexts, this slowing can also indicate emotional difficulty. The person taking more time because the topic is painful or because they are choosing their words with unusual care. Hesitation sounds, the ums and uhs and you knows that appear in speech, serve an interesting dual function. On one level, they are simple processing markers, the audible equivalent of the brain saying, "Hold on, I'm still working on this." On another level, their frequency and distribution in a person's speech can reveal something about their relationship to the content they are speaking about. People who are anxious, uncertain, or emotionally uncomfortable with a topic tend to produce more hesitation markers more often in more unusual places. Research by linguist Janet Miller at Columbia University found that the density of filled pauses increased significantly when subjects were asked about topics that touched on personal vulnerability or social shame. There is also the matter of response latency, the gap between the moment a question is asked and the moment an answer begins. Most questions in ordinary conversation receive responses within a fraction of a second. When the response latency extends, when someone takes notably longer than usual to answer, it signals that something in the question required more processing than a simple retrieval. This might be because the question was genuinely complex, or it might be because the honest answer and the intended answer are different things, and the brain is doing the work of selecting which to produce. The grammar of silence. Perhaps the most underestimated element of vocal communication is silence itself. Western cultures, in particular, tend to experience silence as a conversational failure, a gap that must be filled, a void that signals awkwardness, the dreaded dead air to be avoided at all costs. This avoidance instinct is so strong that many people will fill a silence with anything: a non-answer, a social platitude, a random observation, rather than tolerate the discomfort of empty space. But silence is not empty. In the hands of a skilled communicator, when a difficult question meets silence rather than words, a subject is asked about their relationship with a late parent. There is a pause, 2, 3, 4 seconds, before they speak. In those seconds, more is communicated than in the sentence that follows. The pause announces that this question has landed somewhere deep, that the territory is not casual, that whatever comes next has been retrieved from a place that required genuine reaching, not surface recall. Silence also serves as an amplifier in conversation. When a skilled therapist, negotiator, or interviewer asks an important question and then simply waits, fully, comfortably, without filling the space, the other person is left with an unusual experience, a space large enough to put something true into. The absence of verbal pressure creates a kind of conversational gravity that draws out content that a direct follow-up question might have precluded. Some of the most significant disclosures in human conversation happen not in response to a question, but in response to a silence. Dr. Sarah Chen, a clinical psychologist at the University of British Columbia who specializes in trauma-informed communication, describes what she calls the waiting architecture, a deliberate practice of allowing silences to extend beyond the socially comfortable threshold before speaking. The moment that feels uncomfortable, she says in her published lectures, is often exactly where the most important thing is waiting to emerge. Our instinct to fill silence is really an instinct to protect ourselves from the weight of what might surface. Learning to stay in that discomfort is one of the most powerful things you can do in any important conversation. The emotional texture of word choice, beyond pitch, tempo, and silence, there is a subtler layer of the vocal channel that most people overlook entirely, the specific words a person reaches for when they are under emotional pressure. Under stress, anxiety, or the effort of managing a difficult internal state, language changes in characteristic ways. People who are experiencing guilt or who are attempting to manage a false version of events tend toward over-explanation. They produce more detail than is necessary, circling back to the same points, adding qualifications and elaborations that an innocent and relaxed person would never bother with. The brain, engaged in the labor of supporting a false narrative, generates extra material to fill in the gaps and shore up the structure. And this overproduction is itself a signal. There is also a pattern of indirect framing, answering questions not with direct responses, but with answers to adjacent questions that were not quite asked. "Did you go to the meeting on Thursday?" receives a response of, "I was incredibly busy that whole week." That response is not a lie, per se, but it is also not an answer. and the choice to respond to the frame rather than the content is itself informative. Perhaps the most interesting linguistic signal is the use of distancing language, the shift from personal active constructions, "I decided to passive or depersonalized constructions, "it was decided that," "things kind of happened to." This grammatical distancing often correlates with emotional or psychological distancing. The speaker is moving themselves away from events they find uncomfortable to own directly. None of these patterns is definitive in isolation. A person who over-explains may simply be thorough and anxious. A person who uses passive constructions may have learned their communication style in an organizational culture that discourages personal accountability. Always, always, the individual signals must be read in the context of the whole person, the established baseline, and the specific situation. Learning to hear the voice within the voice is ultimately about developing a new kind of listening, one that attends not just to the content of what is said, but to the emotional music underneath the words. When you develop this listening, you will begin to hear things in every conversation that you used to miss entirely. The slight tightening in a friend's voice when they say they are fine, the nearly imperceptible slowdown in a colleague's speech when a particular topic surfaces, the richness of meaning in a silence that the other person is working hard to maintain. The voice, more than any other channel, tells the story of what is happening inside. Words are chosen. The voice simply is. The architecture of trust, subconscious signals, the brain's chemistry, and the biology of human connection. In 1996, a neuroscientist named Giacomo Rizzolatti at the University of Parma made a discovery entirely by accident. He and his team were studying motor neurons in macaque monkeys, specifically neurons that fired when the monkeys performed intentional actions like reaching for food. One afternoon, a research assistant entered the laboratory and reached for his lunch, while a monkey sat watching, electrodes attached. The monitor recording the monkey's motor neuron activity lit up. The monkey had not moved. The monkey had not eaten anything. The monkey had simply watched someone else reach for food, and a section of its brain responded exactly as if the monkey itself had made that reaching motion. When this finding was replicated and extended, it led to the identification of what became known as mirror neurons, a class of nerve cells that activate both when an organism performs an action and when it observes someone else performing the same action. Further research established that an analogous system appears to exist in the human brain, with particular significance for the processing of emotional states. When we watch someone experience an emotion, fear, joy, grief, anticipation, our own brains partially activate the neural architecture of that emotion. This is the biological foundation of empathy. When you feel moved by someone else's pain, when you wince at someone's injury or feel your chest tighten watching someone receive terrible news, you are not imagining their experience. You are, in a very real neurological sense, partially living it. This system has profound implications for everything we have discussed about reading people. When you learn to pay full, genuine, attuned attention to another person, to truly observe their face, their voice, their body, you are not just gathering information, you are activating your own nervous system's resonance with theirs. You are using biology to bridge experience. The mirror neuron system is not a metaphor for connection. It is the mechanism. The neuroscience of trust, from the brain's perspective, is not a feeling. It is a biochemical state, a configuration of hormonal and neurochemical conditions that together produce the subjective experience of safety, openness, and willingness to be vulnerable with another person. The key architect of this state is oxytocin, Often called the bonding hormone or social glue, oxytocin is released in the brain in response to positive social contact. Touch, genuine eye contact, shared laughter, collaborative activity, the experience of being genuinely listened to and understood. When oxytocin levels rise, the amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection center, becomes less reactive. The brain essentially lowers its security protocols, allowing for deeper openness and genuine information exchange. This is why physical presence matters so much in building relationships. A face-to-face conversation generates more oxytocin than a phone call. A phone call generates more than a text message. A warm, genuine hand on a shoulder at a moment of distress can shift a person's neurochemical state in seconds, not because it is a clever technique, but because human touch has been an oxytocin trigger for millions of years of primate evolution. The brilliant Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer, famous for designing the capital city of Brasilia, once said that the hardest thing in design is not the structure, it is the space between the structures. The same is true of trust. Trust is built not in the grand declarations, but in the spaces between, the small, consistent, unremarked upon moments of genuine attention, warmth, and reliability that accumulated over time signal to another person's nervous system. This presence is safe. Dopamine plays a different but equally important role in the chemistry of relationship. Where oxytocin builds the bond, dopamine creates the motivation to maintain it. Every positive social interaction, every moment of being seen, appreciated, made to laugh, heard, triggers a small dopamine. Release that trains the brain to seek more of that experience. This is why genuinely good relationships become, over time, something close to biological necessities. The brain has literally learned to associate that person with reward. Serotonin, the neurotransmitter most associated with social status and a sense of belonging, rises when we feel respected, valued, and meaningfully included in a social group. Research in organizational psychology has consistently found that serotonin levels, measurable through their behavioral correlates, track closely with a person's sense of significance within their professional or social community. When people feel invisible, dismissed, or marginalized, serotonin drops, with cascading effects on mood, motivation, and behavior that are sometimes misread by others as laziness, disengagement, or hostility. Understanding this chemistry has immediate practical value. When someone in your life becomes withdrawn, irritable, or disconnected, the most accurate first hypothesis is not that they are difficult or uncooperative. It is that something in their neurochemical environment has shifted. Their brain's trust and belonging systems are reporting a deficit. The question that unlocks everything is not, what is wrong with you, but what has changed in what you need? The amygdala and the speed of threat. The amygdala, an almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe, present in two hemispheres of the brain, is the brain's emergency response center. It processes incoming sensory information at extraordinary speed, pattern matching against a vast library of stored emotional memories to determine, faster than conscious thought, whether a situation constitutes a threat. When the amygdala detects potential threat, whether physical, social, or psychological, it initiates what physiologists call the stress response, a cascade of hormonal and neurochemical changes that prepare the body for fight, flight, or freeze. Adrenaline spikes, cortisol rises, blood flow shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational deliberation and nuanced social judgment, and toward the body's muscular and respiratory systems. This is why people under significant emotional stress make decisions they later regret. The neurological Capacity for nuanced thinking has been temporarily routed away from the region that would normally provide it. The amygdala, optimized for speed rather than accuracy, is making rapid calls based on pattern matching, not on careful analysis. Every time you have thought afterward, "I don't know why I reacted that way," you were probably watching the aftermath of an amygdala-driven response. For the purposes of reading people, the amygdala has several critical implications. First, the speed of the threat response means that behavioral changes, increased muscle tension, postural shifts, changes in breathing pattern, pupil dilation, shifts in vocal pitch, appear in another person's body before they have consciously processed what is disturbing them. The body knows before the mind does, and this means that a skilled observer can sometimes recognize that a person is moving toward distress before the person themselves is aware of it. Second, because the amygdala pattern matches against stored emotional memories, individual people have highly idiosyncratic triggers. What activates a threat response in one person may be entirely neutral for another, depending on their history. Two people can be in the same conversation, hearing the same words from the same person, and have completely different neurochemical responses, because their personal archives of experience are different. This is why the same behavior in the same context can produce radically different reactions in different people, and why assuming that your own emotional calibration is a universal standard is one of the most consistent sources of interpersonal misunderstanding. Trust, threat, and the unconscious social contract. Human social life, at the neurological level, is organized around a continuous, unconscious evaluation: safe or not safe, friend or threat. This evaluation runs in the background of every interaction, consuming cognitive resources invisibly, shaping responses before we have any conscious awareness of the process. The behavioral signals that feed this evaluation are the same signals we have been discussing throughout this book: eye contact patterns, facial expression authenticity, vocal tone consistency, postural openness or closure, the presence or absence of mirroring. All of these are inputs into the brain's unconscious threat assessment system. When these signals are congruent, when the words, the face, the voice, and the body all tell the same story, the amygdala relaxes. When they are incongruent, when the words say, "I trust you," but the body is pulling back, when the smile doesn't reach the eyes, when the voice says calm, but the hands say tension, the amygdala sounds a quiet alarm. This is the neurological basis of the feeling we all know. Something felt off, but I couldn't say what it was. What you couldn't say was precisely that the incoming signals were not adding up, that there was a mismatch between the conscious content of the interaction and the subcortical pattern analysis your brain was performing. You were right to pay attention. The converse is equally important. When you learn to produce behavioral signals that are genuine and congruent, when your words, your face, your voice, and your body are all saying the same thing, other people's amygdalae relax in your presence. They feel, without knowing why, that they are in safe company. This is not a technique. It is the natural result of authenticity, of being a person whose internal and external states are aligned rather than in conflict. Trust is built on this foundation of congruence, accumulated over time through repeated positive interactions. Every time someone's nervous system reports safety in your presence, a small increment of trust is added. Every time there is incongruence, every time what you say and what you project do not align, that trust is eroded, sometimes in ways that are very difficult to repair. The social brain in groups. One final dimension of the social brain deserves attention here: the way our neurochemical systems respond to group membership and social belonging. Research using functional MRI technology has revealed something extraordinary. When people experience social rejection or exclusion, the brain regions that activate are substantially overlapping with those that process physical pain. Social exclusion does not feel like physical pain as a metaphor. At the level of neural activation, it is processed through some of the same circuitry. This means that the human need to belong is not soft or optional. It is as fundamental and as neurologically serious as the need for physical safety. Understanding this radically reframes many behaviors that people dismiss as oversensitivity or emotional weakness. A person who responds intensely to perceived rejection, or who goes to considerable lengths to maintain social belonging, is not being irrational. They are responding to signals that their nervous system is coding as a survival threat. From the perspective of reading people, this has immediate applications. When someone in a group becomes unusually quiet, unusually agreeable, or unusually contrary, when their behavior shifts in ways that seem disproportionate to the apparent content of the interaction, the most useful question is often, where does this person currently feel they stand in relation to this group? Are they experiencing belonging? Are they feeling marginalized? Is something in this social environment triggering their exclusion alarm? The answers to these questions, once you start asking them, are usually available in the behavioral signals the person is broadcasting, if you have learned to look. The mirror within, emotional intelligence, empathy, and the journey toward self-knowledge. There is a story told among practitioners of developmental psychology about a renowned family therapist in Vienna in the early 1980s. Her name was Dr. Elizabeth Roth, and she had spent more than 30 years working with families in crisis. Students and colleagues would come from across Europe to observe her sessions, trying to understand how she was able to reach people, including deeply defended, trauma-hardened individuals, in ways that decades of conventional therapy had failed to do. One observer, watching through a one-way mirror during an intensely difficult session with a family that had experienced devastating loss, noticed something remarkable. Dr. Roth had not spoken for nearly 8 minutes. The family was talking, haltingly, tearfully, sometimes angrily. But she was simply present, her posture completely open and still, her face fully receptive. And as the observer watched, he noticed something he had never seen before in a therapy session. All 3 family members were, gradually, physically orienting toward her, turning toward this still, silent presence, the way plants turn toward sunlight. Afterward, the feeling what they needed me to feel, so feeling what they needed me to feel, so that they could feel it was safe to feel it. What Dr. Roth was describing, without using the term, was the most advanced application of the skills we have been exploring throughout this book. Not just observing emotional signals, not just intellectually identifying what another person might be experiencing, but genuinely resonating with it, allowing the mirror neuron system, the oxytocin pathway, the full apparatus of human empathic biology to do what it was designed to do. That level of presence is the destination this book is pointing toward. The skills of behavioral observation, baseline awareness, facial expression reading, vocal analysis, and neurochemical understanding are all instruments. But the music they make together when played well is this: the capacity to make another person feel genuinely known. Emotional intelligence, the architecture of understanding. The concept of emotional intelligence, popularized in the mid-1990s by psychologist Daniel Goleman and grounded in earlier research by Peter Salovey and John Mayer at Yale, describes a set of capacities that most educational systems, until recently, did not bother to develop. The ability to perceive emotions accurately, in oneself and others, to use emotional information to guide thinking and behavior, to understand emotional language and the way emotions evolve over time, and to manage emotional states skillfully in service of one's goals and relationships. Goldman's research, drawing on data from hundreds of organizations and thousands of individuals, produced a finding that surprised the business world at the time. In predicting professional success, emotional intelligence was a better predictor than IQ for most roles above a basic technical threshold. The ability to read people, to navigate complex social dynamics, to manage one's own emotional responses under pressure. These turned out to matter more in most real-world contexts than raw cognitive capacity. 2 decades of subsequent research have largely confirmed and refined this finding. High emotional intelligence correlates with better leadership outcomes, more stable long-term relationships, higher resilience under stress, and greater reported life satisfaction. It predicts success in negotiation, in team management, in conflict resolution, and in the kinds of complex, interdependent projects that characterize most meaningful human endeavors. What is the core of emotional intelligence, stripped to its essentials? At the deepest level, it is the capacity for 2 things that most people find genuinely difficult: to feel what you feel fully and without defensive editing, and to allow others to feel what they feel fully and without the urge to fix, dismiss, or redirect. Most of us were never taught to do either of these things. We were taught that certain emotions are acceptable and others are not. We were taught that strong feelings are something to be managed and suppressed rather than understood and integrated. We were taught that when someone expresses a difficult emotion, the appropriate response is to make it stop, with reassurance, with advice, with distraction. And so we walk into adulthood with a vastly limited emotional vocabulary and an instinctive fear of the full range of human feeling. Developing emotional intelligence begins with the reversal of this conditioning, learning to turn toward emotional experience rather than away from it, in yourself first, and then in others. The practice of self-knowledge. There is a paradox at the heart of the art of reading people. The better you understand yourself, the better you understand others. And the better you understand others, the better you understand yourself. The direction of the compass is not always outward. Self-knowledge, as a psychological capacity, is not the same as self-awareness in the casual sense of being conscious that you exist. It is a deeper practice, the sustained, honest investigation of your own emotional landscape, your characteristic patterns of feeling and response, your recurring triggers, the particular circumstances under which you tend to close down or open up, the specific people or situations that consistently provoke reactions in you that seem disproportionate to their cause. These disproportionate reactions are among the most valuable information you can collect. When you find yourself unusually activated by something that most people around you barely notice, that disproportion is a signal pointing somewhere important in your history. Psychologists call these activation patterns schemas or core beliefs. Deeply embedded interpretive frameworks, typically formed in childhood, that continue to shape how we perceive and respond to situations long after the original context that created them has dissolved. A child who grew up with an emotionally unpredictable parent may become an adult who reads significant anxiety into other people's minor mood shifts, scanning the environment constantly for early warning signs of disapproval or withdrawal. This hypervigilance is not a character flaw. It was once a genuinely adaptive strategy for navigating a difficult environment, but carried into adult contexts where it is no longer necessary, it can cause considerable suffering and significant interpersonal misreading. The process of developing self-knowledge is, in large part, the process of bringing these schemas into conscious awareness, recognizing them, naming them, understanding where they came from, and then, gradually, learning to distinguish between the situations where the old pattern applies and those where it does not. This is not quick work, but it is some of the most important work a person can do, both for their own well-being and for the quality of their relationships. Empathy in depth. Beyond cognitive understanding, empathy is often described as putting yourself in someone else's shoes, an act of imaginative perspective-taking, of intellectually constructing a model of what another person might be experiencing. This cognitive empathy is real, and it is valuable, but it is only one layer of what is possible. Beneath cognitive empathy is affective empathy, the actual felt resonance with another person's emotional state. This is the empathy that makes you wince when you see someone else hurt, that makes your eyes fill when a friend is crying, that makes your chest lift when you witness someone else's genuine joy. This is the empathy that Dr. Elizabeth Roth was practicing in her 8-minute silence, not thinking about what the family was feeling, but actually receiving it, letting it register fully in her own nervous system. And beneath affective empathy is what some researchers call compassionate empathy, the combination of felt resonance with the motivational orientation to respond helpfully. This is empathy that moves. It does not just understand and feel alongside another person. It asks, given what I understand about what they are experiencing, what response from me serves them best right now? The development of all 3 levels of empathy is, at its core, the development of a particular kind of perceptual sensitivity. You are learning to receive another person more fully, to let their reality land in you without immediately processing it through your own needs, fears, projections, and interpretive frameworks. This is harder than it sounds, because every piece of information we receive from another person passes through the filter of our own experience before we can process it. Practicing empathy means developing awareness of that filter, noticing when you are hearing someone else's experience through the lens of your own reactions rather than truly receiving theirs. It means asking, in any moment of strong reaction to another person, what am I actually perceiving and what am I projecting? Meditation practices, and particularly the mindfulness practices developed in contemplative traditions and now validated extensively in clinical research, appear to directly develop this capacity. By training sustained, non-reactive attention, these practices strengthen the neural circuits associated with both affective resonance and the regulation of one's own emotional response. The evidence suggests that regular contemplative practice does not just make people feel calmer, it actually changes the functional architecture of the social brain, the whole person, integration, and the examined life. We began this book with the observation that every person you have ever encountered has been communicating far more than their words convey. We have traveled through the landscape of that silent communication, the face, the voice, the body, the brain's chemistry, the social architecture of trust and belonging. And in each territory, we have found the same fundamental truth. Human beings are vastly more readable than they appear, once you have learned the language. But reading people accurately is not ultimately about technique. It is about the quality of attention you bring to your encounters with other human beings. Techniques can be learned and applied without genuine presence. And techniques applied without genuine presence produce, at best, a crude approximation of understanding, useful for certain practical purposes, but missing the deeper register where real connection lives. The people who become truly extraordinary at understanding others, the therapists, the great teachers, the leaders who transform organizations, the friends whose presence genuinely changes your experience of your own life, share something that goes beyond skill. They are genuinely curious about other people. They experience Another person's inner life, not as a problem to be solved or a system to be decoded, but as something inherently interesting, inherently worthy of attention, inherently as real and as complex as their own. This curiosity is a moral orientation as much as a cognitive one. It rests on the conviction that every person in your life is carrying a complete world of experience, perception, memory, and feeling that is as intricate and as consequential as your own, and that the encounter between your world and theirs, if entered into with genuine attention and genuine care, is one of the most extraordinary things that human existence makes available. The human compass, properly understood, does not simply point toward other people. It points equally back toward yourself. Every person you encounter deeply is also a mirror, showing you something about your own patterns, your own history, your own uncharted internal territories. The work of understanding others and the work of understanding yourself are not separate disciplines. They are the same practice, approached from different angles. In the end, what this book is pointing toward is something simpler than any technique and more powerful than any skill. The decision, made over and over again in the ordinary moments of ordinary days, to be genuinely present, to look at the person in front of you and allow yourself to actually see them. Not just their words, not just their surface presentation, not just the version of themselves they are performing, but the full human being carrying everything they carry, saying everything they cannot quite say. That act of genuine seeing, offered consistently, offered freely, offered without agenda, is the deepest thing one person can give another. It is the foundation of every meaningful relationship. It is the opposite of loneliness, and it begins right now in the willingness to pay attention.